I confronted my mom after my wealthy ex crashed her birthday dinner and she said I should be grateful to have options. When I was younger, I never really thought about the type of guy I'd want to settle down with. My family, especially my mom, always seemed to have that vision figured out for me, someone successful. With a promising future, as they liked to put it. They weren't talking about someone who was just kind or funny or treated me with respect. They meant someone who made 6 figures, wore suits, and could promise financial security. I'd just nod along whenever the subject came up, assuming I'd find someone who matched their ideal one day. Then, a little over a year ago, I met Ryan, and my view of relationships changed. Ryan isn't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but he's genuinely kind, the type of person who thinks of others before himself. He's patient, respectful, and thoughtful in ways that can't be bought. He doesn't shower me with flashy gifts, but he's always there for me, supporting me in ways I hadn't known I needed. We've been together a year now, and while our life together is simple, it's fulfilling. He has this quiet, comforting presence, and just being with him makes me feel like I'm right where I belong. My family doesn't see it that way. In their eyes, Ryan is settling. They don't come out and say it directly, but it's in the way they react to him, how they downplay his qualities, as if kindness and loyalty somehow don't matter without the right bank balance. I know they don't think he's good enough for me, which stings because they only seem to value what's on the surface. I suppose that's why they were so obsessed with my ex. Daniel. Daniel is the kind of guy my mom always envisioned for me, successful, ambitious, and, most importantly, very wealthy. At first, he seemed like a dream, sweeping me off my feet with his charm and money. Expensive gifts, luxurious trips, dining in places I could only dream of. He made sure I had it all. And my family couldn't have been happier, practically fawning over him every time they got the chance. But things with Daniel weren't as perfect as they looked. Behind the glamorous surface was a man who used his wealth to control me. He made me feel small, as if my worth was tied to what he could provide. And he always had a way of making me feel indebted to him. The gifts weren't out of love, they were transactions meant to keep me in line, to keep me dependent. I left him after realizing how toxic it was. And it was a hard break. My family, however, took it harder than I did, convinced I'd thrown away a perfect relationship. When my mom's birthday rolled around last week, I wanted to make it special for her. Despite our different values, she means the world to me. And even though she can't understand my decision to leave Daniel, I hoped that I could show her how happy I am with Ryan. So I planned a cozy dinner for the 3 of us. Just a simple celebration with my mom and the man I love. Ryan went out of his way to make sure it was memorable for her, even picking out a nice restaurant he could comfortably afford. He saved up to make sure everything went smoothly, and I could see how excited he was to make a good impression. But as much as Ryan tried, I knew there was a part of my mom that wouldn't be impressed. No matter what he did, she wanted the sparkle, the luxury that she'd gotten used to with Daniel. But I hoped she'd put that aside, if only for this one night, and appreciate the thought and effort Ryan was putting into celebrating her. The evening was off to a warm start. We'd arrived at the restaurant early, and Ryan was trying to keep the mood light, cracking little jokes to ease my mom's occasional judgmental glances. I could see the effort he was putting in, and while my mom wasn't exactly fawning over him, she seemed happy enough to be out celebrating. But then, just as we were settling in, Daniel showed up. It was like he stepped right out of a magazine, dressed in an expensive suit. He had a designer bag in hand and a confident grin that immediately made him the center of attention. My heart sank as I realized he wasn't just there by chance, he'd come with a purpose. Somehow, he'd found out about my mom's birthday dinner, probably through mutual friends, and decided to make an entrance. He strolled over to our table like he'd been invited, his gaze flickering to me with that same smug look I remembered too well. Before I could even react, my mom's face lit up as if she'd just seen a celebrity. "Daniel," she gasped, reaching up to hug him. He handed her the designer handbag, and she looked like she'd just been handed a treasure chest. My stomach tightened as I watched her fawn over the gift, practically forgetting Ryan and me entirely. She was all smiles, not once questioning why he'd shown up unannounced. As if crashing the dinner and flashing his wealth wasn't enough, Daniel then suggested upgrading to a better restaurant. "I've got a reservation at Le Bon Maison," he said, his voice smooth and inviting. Le Bon Maison was in a whole different league than where we were. Fine dining, elegant ambiance, and a price tag to match. I could feel Ryan stiffen beside me. But my mom's reaction was instant. She nodded eagerly, looking at me like this was the best idea she'd heard all night. "Why don't we just go there?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. It was as if she'd forgotten entirely that this was Ryan's evening to plan. That he'd carefully chosen this place because it was what he could afford and still make the night special. I could feel the tension building. A mixture of frustration and embarrassment. But I pushed it down for my mom's sake. Ryan gave me a small, reassuring nod, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. And so, we left the restaurant Ryan had chosen and made our way to Le Bon Maison. A place we both knew was far outside of Ryan's comfort zone. It was a beautiful restaurant. Undeniably elegant, with soft lighting, chandeliers, and waitstaff who moved with quiet efficiency. My mom looked like she was in heaven, leaning into the luxurious atmosphere. The kind of place she'd probably imagined when she thought of celebrating. But I couldn't enjoy it. Watching Ryan sit there, trying his best to keep up with a dinner that had spiraled into something entirely out of his control, was painful. Daniel, on the other hand, was completely in his element, ordering wine, recommending dishes, and dropping hints of his latest business ventures, the kind that made his wealth unmistakable. He never missed an opportunity to remind us of his success, glancing occasionally at Ryan as if to make sure he understood who was in charge. I could tell that Ryan was doing his best to hold it together. But I could see the discomfort in every gesture, the way he carefully chose his words, probably questioning if he even belonged here. I wanted to grab his hand, to tell him that none of this mattered, that this dinner wasn't supposed to be a competition. But Daniel had made it into one. And my mom seemed to love every moment of it. It was humiliating, watching her eat up every ounce of Daniel's performance. She was all smiles, laughing at his jokes, completely charmed by the presence of a man who could afford the finer things she valued so highly. And in the back of my mind, I felt a flicker of anger, not just toward Daniel, but toward my mom, who was so willing to overlook everything he'd done to me, just because he showed up with the right brand names and the right price tag. Dinner at Le Bon Maison was a display I'd hoped I'd never see again. The restaurant's ambiance, soft candlelight, the gentle clinking of silverware, the muted murmur of laughter and conversation, would have been beautiful if it weren't for the discomfort that seemed to settle over our table. The room felt too close, too intimate, and I could sense Ryan shrinking under the pressure, trying his best to fit in. He'd dressed nicely, but his clothes didn't carry the same high-end sheen that Daniel's did. My mom was quick to point that out, though indirectly. She turned to Daniel, eyes wide, and said, "It's so nice to see you looking so polished. You know, I don't think I've ever seen anyone put themselves together quite like you." I could practically feel her gaze shift toward Ryan, her smile a little too sweet, as if waiting for him to pick up on what she wasn't saying out loud. Ryan smiled back politely, but I could see the hurt flash in his eyes. He'd spent hours getting ready for this evening, had picked out what he thought would be nice enough, even bought a new jacket just for tonight, all because he wanted to make a good impression on her. But sitting across from Daniel, with his designer watch glinting in the candlelight and his easy arrogance, Ryan was left looking like he was trying too hard. He shifted in his seat, forcing a small, tight smile, trying to mask the embarrassment that I knew was eating at him. Meanwhile, my mom kept the conversation firmly centered on Daniel. She asked about his latest business ventures, leaning in with an admiration that was impossible to ignore. She never once stopped to ask Ryan a question, to include him in the discussion. To her, it was as if he wasn't there. Daniel, of course, reveled in the attention, slipping into his role with that practiced charm I used to fall for. He gave her all the right answers, talking about his recent real estate deals, the exclusive vacation spots he'd booked for the year, sprinkling the conversation with just enough humble brags to keep her hanging on every word. Then, as if she hadn't already made her preferences painfully clear, my mom finally turned to me and said, "You had the perfect guy right here. And you let him go. What were you thinking?" She looked at me, as if she genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would walk away from Daniel. Her tone was light, a joking lilt to it. But I could feel the sting of it. A sharp jab at the life I'd chosen after Daniel. I forced myself to stay composed, to ignore the heat rising in my face as I looked over at Ryan. I could see him glancing down, doing his best to hide how uncomfortable he felt. He was trying so hard to make this work, to fit into this world that he wasn't part of, all because he cared about me, and because I'd asked him to be here. And now he was stuck listening to my mom praise the man who'd treated me like a trophy. A man who, no matter how polished he looked, had left me feeling hollow and trapped. I couldn't believe my mom's blindness, her complete disregard for how her words were affecting Ryan. But before I could say anything, she leaned over to me, her voice loud enough for both men to hear, and said, "You should be grateful. You know, how many women get to have options like this? A man like Daniel who can provide you with a secure future. Or a man like Ryan who, well, is good-hearted." She shrugged, as if the words, "good-hearted," were somehow a consolation prize. The words hung in the air, heavy and mortifying. I felt as if she'd just peeled back every bit of my happiness with Ryan, reducing it to something trivial, something disposable in the face of Daniel's wealth. And the worst part was that she'd said it right in front of him. As though he was nothing but an accessory, a footnote in my life. I tried to deflect, forcing a smile and attempting to shift the conversation. But the damage was done. My mom had made her opinion clear. She couldn't see Ryan for who he truly was. All she could see was the surface. The paycheck, the outward appearance, and in her eyes, that would never be enough. The rest of the dinner was agonizing. Daniel continued to bask in the glow of my mom's praise, occasionally glancing over at me with a self-satisfied look that said he knew he still held the upper hand. Ryan, on the other hand, grew quieter and quieter, withdrawing into himself with each passing comment, each comparison. He didn't deserve this, and yet here he was, enduring it because he wanted to be there for me and make the evening special for my mom. I felt trapped. I wanted to tell my mom to stop, to look at the person she was hurting, but I didn't want to ruin her birthday by causing a scene. Instead, I sat there, feeling helpless, the weight of her comments pressing down on me like stones. I'd been so excited to show her what I had with Ryan. To show her that love and happiness didn't need to be dressed up in wealth and status. But all she saw was what she wanted to see, the wealth and flash she associated with Daniel, and the quiet stability she looked down on in Ryan. By the time dessert came, Ryan was practically silent, and I couldn't even taste the food in front of me. I was just watching the clock, waiting for the evening to end, waiting for the chance to pull my mom aside and tell her what I'd been holding back all night. As the dinner wrapped up, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't said pressing down on me. Watching Ryan head outside, where he was waiting for me by the car, I knew I couldn't let the evening end without speaking to my mom. She was still smiling, chatting animatedly with Daniel as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't spent the entire night tearing down my relationship to build Daniel back up in her mind. I turned to her and gently took her by the arm, pulling her aside just out of earshot of Daniel. Her smile faltered, and she looked at me, surprised by the sudden seriousness in my expression. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the hurt and frustration I'd held back all night threatened to spill out. "Mom," I began, my voice softer than I intended. "You were really hurtful tonight. All those things you said about Daniel, about me having options, it was disrespectful to Ryan and to me." The words felt heavier with each syllable, my heart pounding as I finally spoke the truth I'd kept bottled up for so long. Her expression shifted, a look of irritation flashing in her eyes as she rolled them dismissively. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, waving her hand. "You're overreacting. Daniel was being thoughtful, and he went out of his way to make my night special. You should be grateful he still cares about you." I shook my head, trying to contain the anger that was bubbling up. "Mom, You don't understand. Daniel didn't crash this dinner out of kindness. He showed up to prove something. To show that he can still control me. That he still has some kind of power over me. He used those gifts and the money to make you see him the way he wants you to. Not the way he really is. I could see the disbelief in her eyes. A kind of stubborn resistance that made my stomach churn. She wasn't listening, she didn't want to understand. To her, Daniel's wealth and charm meant more than the real pain he'd caused me. The way he'd used those exact same tactics to control and manipulate me when we were together. She let out a short sigh. Shaking her head. You're throwing away a better future, she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. A man like Daniel can give you stability, security, all the things that matter. Ryan is sweet, but he'll never be able to provide for you like Daniel can. Don't you see? You're making things harder for yourself by settling for less. Settling for less. The words echoed in my mind. Sharp and cold, cutting deeper than I expected. I wanted to shout. To tell her that money wasn't what I needed. That I didn't want to be someone's trophy. Someone's afterthought in a world of wealth and power games. I wanted to tell her that love, real love, didn't come from the flash of a designer bag or a fancy restaurant. But I knew it wouldn't reach her. She was locked in her own vision of the life she thought I should want. Unwilling to see beyond the luxury and the glitter Daniel used to hide his true self. Instead, I took a deep breath. Forcing myself to stay calm. Ryan may not have Daniel's money, I said, my voice steady, but he loves me, Mom. He respects me. He doesn't treat me like an object he can control. Like a possession he can show off. He makes me feel valued for who I am. Not what I can give him. And that's worth more to me than any amount of money. Her eyes narrowed, her face hardening. You don't know what you're saying, she replied, her voice clipped. You're being foolish. Thinking love alone can build a future. A life without stability will leave you miserable. And you're too young to understand that. One day, you'll regret this. I felt a surge of anger and hurt. And for a moment, I wanted to snap back. To tell her that maybe the life she wanted for me wasn't the life I wanted for myself. But I knew that no matter what I said, she wouldn't listen. She was too caught up in her idea of success and security. Her belief that financial comfort was the only path to happiness. Nothing I could say would change her mind. So I stood there, silent and disappointed, watching as she walked back to the table. A dismissive wave of her hand, the only acknowledgement of the conversation we'd just had. She joined Daniel again, her laughter floating through the room as she engaged with him. Almost as if she were determined to erase everything I'd said. I felt an ache in my chest. A dull realization that I'd never be able to reach her. That she'd never understand why I'd left Daniel. Or why I'd chosen to be with someone like Ryan. When I finally made my way outside, Ryan was waiting for me. Leaning against the car, his face thoughtful but quiet. I could tell he knew what had happened. That he'd seen the way my mom had dismissed us both. How she'd taken Daniel's side without hesitation. He didn't ask me what I'd said. Didn't push for details. He simply opened the car door for me, offering me a small, reassuring smile, as if to say that, no matter what, he was here. As we drove away, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the evening was over. That I'd finally spoken my mind. Even if it hadn't changed anything. But the sorrow was deeper. A realization that my mom's idea of love and security would always be different from mine. That she'd never fully support the life I'd chosen. She would always see Ryan as less. As an option I'd settled for. No matter how happy he made me. In the days that followed, I hoped she'd come around. That she'd reconsider her words. Maybe even apologize. But instead, I heard from family members that she'd been telling everyone how I'd embarrassed her. How I'd made a scene at her birthday dinner over something as trivial as Daniel's arrival. I felt blindsided, betrayed by the way she'd twisted things, framing me as the ungrateful, stubborn daughter who didn't know a good thing when she had it. Some of my relatives reached out, some sympathetic, some echoing her words. They told me I should have been grateful that Daniel cared enough to show up. That I was dramatic for making it a problem when he'd done such a nice thing. I could hardly believe it. Here was a man who'd tried to control me, who'd shown up uninvited to a dinner meant to be about my relationship with Ryan, and somehow I was the one in the wrong? It left me questioning myself, doubting if I'd been wrong to confront her, if maybe I had overreacted. Was I really being dramatic, for not wanting to be manipulated? For wanting my relationship with Ryan to be respected? I didn't know anymore. My family's words had shaken me, leaving me feeling lost, as if the life I'd chosen for myself, the life I was happy in, was somehow wrong in their eyes. In those moments, Ryan was my anchor. He never judged, never questioned my decision to confront her. Even when I voiced my doubts, he was just there, a steady presence, reminding me of the love and respect we shared, even if it was invisible to everyone else. And in those moments, I felt a small comfort, a reassurance that, despite everything, I had made the right choice for myself, even if it meant my family would never understand. After that night, it felt like my mom had flipped a switch. Word of our confrontation spread quickly, and soon, I was getting messages and phone calls from family members, each one more upsetting than the last. Some relatives called, seemingly concerned, only to echo my mom's view that I was overreacting and ungrateful. Others took a softer approach but still couldn't help letting their disappointment slip through. They couldn't understand why I'd thrown away a chance at financial security with Daniel, choosing, as they saw it, a man who could offer me nothing but love. The things they said stung, each word chipping away at the confidence I'd felt when I stood up for myself. I kept hearing the same line over and over again, that I should be grateful Daniel still cared enough to make such a grand gesture. That any woman would be lucky to have options like these. My aunt even went so far as to tell me I was being selfish for not putting the family first, accusing me of choosing my feelings over my future. Every comment left me feeling more alone, more alienated from the people I thought would support me. I had hoped they would understand why I'd left Daniel in the first place, why I'd chosen a different path, one where I was valued for who I was, not for my ability to fit into someone else's world. But they didn't. To them, I was just another young woman, making mistakes, and throwing away good fortune. It was during one of these family calls that I started to question myself more deeply. I remember my cousin asking, "What do you see in Ryan that Daniel didn't give you?" Her tone was gentle, even sympathetic, but it made my heart sink. She had known me my whole life, and even she couldn't understand what I saw in Ryan, why I'd chosen him over Daniel. That night, I lay in bed, replaying the dinner in my head, every detail growing sharper and more painful. Had I been too hard on my mom? Was I unfair to her, expecting her to just let go of her idea of success for me? I thought about the life Daniel offered, the trips, the stability, the wealth, and the security that came with it. I wondered if maybe I was being ungrateful, as they said, if I was letting my pride or emotions blind me to a better future. But then, another thought crept in, one that settled the doubt as quickly as it had risen. The memory of what it had felt like to be with Daniel. I remembered the nights we spent arguing, his condescending remarks, the way he'd twist my words to make me feel small. His wealth had been a wall between us, something he used to keep me on edge, always questioning if I was worthy of his world. I remembered how he'd make it clear that everything we had was because of him. His success, his generosity, every gift, was a reminder that he had the power. And then I thought about Ryan, how he'd never once used his financial situation to define or limit us. With him, I felt free. We didn't have extravagant vacations or luxury gifts, but we had each other. Genuinely and simply, he valued my opinions, respected my boundaries, and made me feel like an equal. When I was with him, I didn't feel like I was being molded to fit someone else's ideal. I felt like I was enough, just as I was. As I lay there, I realized that my family's words weren't about me at all. They were about their vision of success, their idea of what happiness should look like, molded by their own fears and desires. To them, Ryan represented insecurity, a risk that didn't fit into their polished view of the future. They couldn't see that love, in all its simplicity, could be enough. But even with this clarity, it didn't make facing them any easier. Over the next few days, I found myself avoiding family gatherings and dodging phone calls, dreading the inevitable conversations and judgment. I wasn't ready to hear more comments about how I was settling, or making things harder for myself. And though I tried to keep my head high, a part of me still felt hurt. Still wanted them to see what I saw in Ryan. To understand that I wasn't settling at all. The silence that grew between my family and me was painful. My mom, who I'd once confided in about so much, now seemed like a stranger, more invested in appearances than in understanding me. I missed the feeling of support, the ease of family gatherings that were now so uncomfortable. But no matter how much I longed for things to go back to the way they were, I knew I couldn't turn back. I couldn't sacrifice my happiness, my peace, just to fit into their mold of what life should be. Each day, I fought to remind myself that my worth wasn't tied to the image they had of my life, to the wealth and status they thought would protect me. But it wasn't easy. I felt the weight of their disapproval, the sting of their judgments, and the loneliness of standing by a decision that almost no one else understood. Ryan sensed the change, too. He never asked directly, but he noticed the missed calls, the silence after family gatherings, and the moments when I'd get lost in thought. He'd reach for my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. His quiet presence a balm for the ache my family's disapproval left behind. He didn't have to say anything. His support was a reminder that, even if the world didn't understand us, we understood each other. And in those moments, I found strength. I realized that I didn't need their approval, didn't need them to validate my choices, to confirm that my happiness was real. I had chosen a life that brought me peace, that felt genuine, and even if they couldn't see it, I knew that was enough. The fallout from that night left me with questions I couldn't shake, the kind that lingered and grew louder in the quiet. Every time I thought about my family's reactions, I felt a mixture of hurt and anger. I couldn't believe they'd reduced my happiness with Ryan to settling. It was as if they saw my life, my choices, through a different lens entirely, one focused solely on money and appearances. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that their version of love and loyalty was different from mine. I had to confront the reality that my family measured worth in ways that felt hollow to me. To them, wealth was security, luxury was happiness, and a man's value was tied to what he could offer financially. In their eyes, Daniel was perfect because he had money, charm, and the kind of life that promised comfort. But they had never seen the other side, the side that made me feel small and insignificant. Daniel's love had come with conditions, unspoken rules that kept me on edge, constantly trying to live up to his image of the perfect partner. I had become a reflection of what he wanted, rather than who I was. With Ryan, it was different. He'd never made me feel like I had to prove myself, never used his presence or finances to control me. He didn't need to pull me into his world and reshape me to fit some ideal. Instead, he saw me, really saw me, for who I was. There was a simplicity to his love that felt pure, unpretentious. With him, I was enough, exactly as I was. I didn't have to compete with anyone, didn't have to fit into someone else's mold of success. I could just be. As I reflected on our relationship, I saw the ways Ryan had enriched my life. We didn't have designer bags, luxury restaurants, or 5-star vacations, but we had something that felt real and lasting. He respected me, treated me with kindness, and made me feel valued. And that respect, that genuine regard for who I was worth more to me than anything money could buy. Ryan's love came without strings, without expectations. He wanted me for who I was, not for what I could bring into his life. I began to wonder how my family could look at Daniel and Ryan and only see dollar signs. Could they not see that loyalty, kindness, and mutual respect were worth more than any designer bag or flashy vacation? Did they not understand that happiness couldn't be bought, that real love didn't come with a price tag? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that my family's values didn't align with mine. They seemed to think that love was something you could measure by the size of a bank account, by the convenience and comfort that wealth could bring. But to me, love had never been about security or luxury. It was about connection, about finding someone who saw me as an equal, who wanted to build a life with me based on trust and respect. And while I understood that my family wanted the best for me, their version of the best was something I didn't recognize anymore. I realized that by leaving Daniel, I hadn't just chosen a different partner, I had chosen a different life. One that was built on values I held close to my heart. And with Ryan, I'd found someone who shared those values. Someone who valued people over possessions, relationships over appearances. He made me feel safe in a way that had nothing to do with money. It was a safety rooted in his kindness, his empathy, and his unwavering loyalty. In choosing Ryan, I had chosen a life of simplicity, of mutual respect and understanding. And yes, it wasn't the life my family had imagined for me, but it was a life that felt authentic. One that I could embrace fully without sacrificing who I was. I didn't want to live a life defined by someone else's standards. A life where my worth was measured by the status of the man beside me. As I sat with these thoughts, I felt a newfound sense of clarity. My family's expectations might never change, and they might never understand why I had chosen the path I had. But that was okay. I didn't need their approval to know my own worth, to recognize the value of the love I had with Ryan. Their judgment, their fixation on wealth, was theirs to carry. I was done letting it weigh me down. In the end, I knew that love wasn't about luxury, wasn't about the flash or the appearance of success. It was about loyalty, respect, and a shared vision for the future. And while my family might not see that, I knew it was real. Ryan's love was real. The life we were building was real. And for the first time, I felt free from the need to justify it. I'd found my own version of happiness. And even if it didn't fit into their narrow view, it was mine, and that was enough.